This episode of Gators Breakdown is brought to you by Shark Coatings. Visit sharkfloorcoatings.com when you need professional floor coating services done right the first time.
Want more Gators Breakdown? Join Gators Breakdown Plus. Starting at $3 a month. Get access to unique episodes, plus a blog, chat room, giveaways, shoutouts, and more. Gators Breakdown Plus is furthering the interaction with fans and listeners like you. Head to gatorsbreakdown.supportingcast.fm to join Gators Breakdown Plus today. Gators Breakdown. Because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Joining me here on this Monday night, co-host Will Miles. You can find him at readandreaction.com. Read and Reaction YouTube, on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. And Will, hope you had a good Thanksgiving, all the time with family and everything that comes along with this time of year. So, man, I hope you and your family got to spend a whole lot of time together.
Yeah, a little bit too much. On Sunday, it was raining up here. My wife and I both looked at each other like, it's time to send them back to school. But, it was a good time. We stayed up here, didn't have anybody visiting, which is kind of unique for us. Usually we're heading down to Florida this time of year. So
That's right.
We're going down a couple of weeks for something else. So, I'll be down there soon enough to experience 2 days of sunshine, and then back up here where it's gray and dreary, and a lot like Twitter after the game the other night.
Ooh, tell me about it. Yes, Friday, of course, it was Black Friday night. Florida State get together, and Florida State gives Florida the sixth loss of the season for Florida to finish the season 6-6, and oof. Bummer into the season, Will, after beating South Carolina, and we've seen what's happened to them since then. But Florida beating South Carolina, and then everything looking kind of on the way up. Only for Florida to drop the last two games. Vandy, FSU to end the season. Florida ends 6-6, and of course, Will, we can get into it. I know you released an article detailing and looking at what you saw in Florida's loss to FSU, and I guess overall big takeaway, maybe each side of the ball.
Yeah, so on the offensive side of the ball, I think my takeaway is that Anthony Richardson remains an enigma and incredibly inconsistent. And he played fantastic in the first half, or at least until that last drive of the first half. And then from there on, he was just terrible until essentially the final drive. And there's if you score 38 points, you should be able to win the game. At the same time, it's realistic to look at that and say, can we just get a little bit of consistency at all? And, if you look back at his last 8 or 9 games, basically since the USF game, it's been up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And, that stuff isn't going to fly at the next level. And quite honestly, it wouldn't fly for another year of college football. So frustrating night on the offensive side of the ball, because this was a team that at its high, at its most efficient, has the ability to put up points on anybody, which isn't something that we could say last year. But at its low, has the ability to put up points on nobody. And to have those highs and those lows, it was just sort of a microcosm. That in the first half, it looked like Florida State couldn't stop. It literally looked like Florida was playing against the Florida defense in the first half. And then in the second half, it finally looked like they were playing against the Florida State defense. On the defensive side of the ball, my takeaway is that the staff is committed to its scheme, and it's not going to make an adjustment for the opponent. And I don't know whether I like that or not, but I know that they're going to crash and burn with that philosophy, or they're going to succeed with that philosophy, because it was pretty clear coming in from the film that I looked at least, that playing zone against Jordan Travis was the best way to neutralize him. And they decided they were going to go man-to-man. And they decided that they were going to challenge him to make throws into tight spaces. And for the most part, he wasn't actually able to do that,
right? Yeah.
Except for the couple that he chucked up to Wilson on big-time third downs. But what he was able to do was extend plays on third down, especially down in the red zone, the 2 big ones that he was able to extend.
And even then, make some tackles.
Wow. So, it's hard to blame scheme when you got 7 guys in the backfield who could tackle him and get their hands on him. At the same time,
Even
they
that
kept,
had my bad. Okay,
well, they kept going back to that well, right? They kept doing the same thing. And I when the game started, I don't think I sent it to you, but I sent it to Nick. I went, oh, they're in single high. This is bad. Like I don't like being in single high safeties. I don't like bringing a ton of blitzes against Florida State. I don't think that's an effective way to impact them. And they decided to keep doing it. If you go back and actually watch the film, there's one third down where they played zone, and that was the drive where they forced it to fourth down. And then on fourth down, they played zone again, and that's the one that Trey Dean almost intercepted and took the other way. And from then on, I don't recall seeing them play zone, at least, 4-man rush with a zone dropping on any other third down the rest of the game. And it turns out Florida State went, like 9 of 16 or something on third downs. They just were not successful at getting Florida State off the field. They tie the game at 38. And you're sitting there going, well, this is the first time one of these comebacks has actually turned into a tie. We've had games again, the game against Tennessee kind of was back and forth, and Florida could just never get over the hump. Same thing with LSU after LSU raced in front by a couple of touchdowns. Quite honestly, same thing with Vanderbilt last week. It wasn't back and forth, but Florida had to race back to try to get into it. This one, they actually got the tie, right? They got it to where they needed to be. And Florida State just went through the defense like it was a hot knife through butter. And that's been the story all year, is that this defense has just not held up its end of the bargain. You look at the overall stats for the offense. The offense, I'm sure we'll get into this. The offense has been okay. I don't think it's been fantastic. I think it's been okay. And the defense has just been terrible. And my takeaway is that they were not willing to adjust, in my mind, to what Florida State did poorly. They said, this is our scheme and we're going to run it. And it gave up 45 points.
Yeah. And not the first time that we could have said, hey, the offense scored enough if the defense had only done its job. So, hey, it's a team sport. We know that. There were a couple times, not many, when the defense did its part and the offense didn't do it. So, it is take and give, but we got some overall stats we'll look into it here at the end of the season. There from team rankings and what they threw out there. So a really good kind of offense defense look. We'll go through the season a bit, of course, inconsistent season there for the Gators. And we'll end the season a little bit with some roster management talk. Of course, transfer portal going to be hot and heavy coming up. You already see it starting right now. Florida, at least for Florida, Avery Helm deciding he's going to put his name into the transfer portal. But we'll kind of go back and through the recent weeks, who has been dismissed, who's put their name into the transfer portal. And of course, about 3 weeks, early signing day just around the corner. So plenty to get into here as we wrap up this regular season. Billy Napier's first regular season as Gators head coach. Everybody hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're watching on YouTube right now, really helps us out because that YouTube algorithm, something to think about with all the Gator fans watching. So let Gator fans out there, if they're out there on YouTube where they can find some Gators content right here on Gators Breakdown, and be sure, check us in the description there, a link to Gators Breakdown Plus, that Discord server, hopping, major recruiting discussion going on there right now. And of course, all the transfer portal news, recruiting news there at Gators Breakdown Plus in that Discord. You can join by hitting that link in the description. So, well, one thing, I sent this to you. I put it on Twitter as well. And one storyline, of course, if we want to go, we got a lot of overall stats to look at, but one in particular, I think we should really hone in on are the penalties that really seem to dig Florida in some holes these last couple of weeks. And you can look at there. I went penalties by game and put it up there for everybody. So if you're watching on YouTube, you get the graphics of it there. But I'll go through, of course. And besides the last 2 weeks, but besides Vandy and FSU, the rest of the season, yeah, there were some high numbers. But when there were high numbers of penalties, not a lot of yardage to go with it. So if you start with the season opener, Utah, of course, the Gators get that big win to open up the season. But there were 7 penalties in that game, but only 38 yards. Kentucky, in a game you lost where you're not really blaming penalties there, 3 for 28. South Florida, 6 for 48. Tennessee, you had 10 penalties. It was your first road game of the season, but only 47 yards. No, it didn't really kill Florida in that game. Eastern Washington, 5 for 40. Missouri, 1 for 5. Didn't have hardly any penalties there versus Missouri. LSU, 5 for 50. And then you had a bye week, then you go play Georgia. You had 7 penalties, 53 yards. There were some costly ones in there a little bit, but didn't really cost Florida in that game. We knew Georgia was probably going to win that game anyway. Texas A&M, 10 penalties, only 39 yards. South Carolina, 7 for 50. And then the last couple of weeks, going to the road at Vanderbilt, 7 for 80. Those third down penalties on defense, very costly for Florida. Then last week versus FSU, 10 for 91. Costly penalties there as well. Discipline penalties, ones you just don't want to see your team commit there. And Will, that really was just kind of looking at the last 2 weeks there. Just, we don't know what changed. You'd like to see penalties get better as the season goes along, but for whatever reason, there was a high number. But in the last 2 weeks, it was a high number and high yardage. It was the 15-yard variety. It was the late hits. It was the just unexplainable for a lot of them. You don't expect to see those type of penalties in the last 2 games of the season, especially when you had so much momentum going into those games. You weren't killing yourself a whole lot through this season. You needed to get these last 2 games. You needed to ride that wave of momentum, only to see something that was kind of uncharacteristic for this team show up in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I think I told you that a pastor buddy of mine named Josh reached out, and he and I text during the games, and he said that the team plays really hard, but that they seem to be stupid, and that's sort of a decent assessment, I think, for the last couple of games. I mean, he's not insulting their intelligence. He's essentially saying that we're seeing a bunch of penalties that you shouldn't be seeing in week 11, week 12 of the year. You think about the illegal formation in the Vanderbilt game that essentially cost him a touchdown on Montrell Johnson's long run. Think about the illegal formation down in the red zone that could have cost them a touchdown if they hadn't gotten the pass interference penalty against Florida State on Pearsall. You think about all of the undisciplined, unnecessary roughness type penalties that, hitting a guy out of bounds, shoving a guy in the back after the play's over, Eggleston coming up and hitting the Vanderbilt guy right after a 15-yard gain, 3 seconds after the whistle. Those sorts of things are discipline penalties that you don't expect to see, and do, I think, start to sow doubt in terms of all the discipline and all the things that we've heard and have sort of bought into when it comes to Billy Napier. Doesn't mean that he's not disciplining these guys in private. It doesn't mean that a couple of bad games can't just be that, right? That there are a couple of bad games. I think up until the South Carolina game, through the South Carolina game, we would have said from a disciplinary perspective on the field, Florida has looked very, very good this year. And then you have the 2 stinkers there at the end, and say, okay, does that change the narrative? And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, just in terms of the overall season. And you look at, had Florida won the Vanderbilt game, even if they pulled it out by like a point or 2, the whole framework of the season feels different, because at 4-4 against Georgia, we were sitting there going 6-6 probable, 7-5 would be a gift, and 8-4 is probably a miracle. And so if you get the Vanderbilt game and you lose by a touchdown to Florida State, you're unhappy that you lost to Florida State, but you're walking into the offseason saying, hey, we got that 3-1 when we thought we were going to be 2-2. Instead, the Vanderbilt, which kind of felt like, house money, we're already at 7. You lose that game, you're still at 6. Then you lose by a touchdown to Florida State, you're still at 6, and everything just feels different. And I think it's sort of the same thing with the penalties. And again, I think it's hard to measure discipline with just penalties. That sometimes, I mean, if you go back and look, in 2006, Florida was like 104th, I think, overall in penalty yardage per game. In 2008, they were like 108th. So teams were winning the national championship when they had a lot of penalty yards. I think some of that has to do with where the penalties come from. When you're a good team, I think you want to push the edge. So you think about a team like Alabama, and everybody always complains that they get every call, or that they never get holding called on them. Well, part of that is because those guys are taught to push the edge, and every once in a while they're going to get caught, but they're not going to call holding on every single play. I'm okay with a holding call every once in a while if I have a dominant offensive line. What I'm not okay with is guys constantly getting beat and dragging somebody down to the ground because they're constantly getting beat. And we didn't have that for the offensive line this year, but there's a difference between those two, right? So the aggressive type of penalty that Florida may get, or an elite team may get, I think is acceptable, and you're okay with those penalty yards. It's the 15-yarder when you hit a guy 4 seconds after the whistle. Those are the things, and the illegal formations where you just don't line up appropriately. Those are the things that need to be eliminated and are concerning when you look at those last couple of games.
Yeah, that was very surprising to see that come out the last couple of weeks when we didn't see those throughout the season. Yeah, I know, where a lot of critics come in for this season in Napier is, wanting to see progress throughout the season. And this was one area you did not, and actually a regression throughout the season. But speaking of the season, let's just go through it one more time, take a look back, maybe trip down memory lane just a bit here, looking at the Gators' 2022 season, Billy Napier's first season. And well, the thing that sticks out the most, of course, and it's something we've harped on all year and everybody else has too, is just maybe the inability to handle success, ride the wave of momentum. Florida just really couldn't build any. And when it seemed like they had, they just gave it away. And of course, I mean, it was the very first two games, Will, of the season were a microcosm of the season. The rest of the season would go this way. You get the big win over Utah. Florida shoots up Will? I think up to number 12 in some of the rankings there, only to go next week and lose to Kentucky at home as well. You could not ride that wave of momentum. And now, don't get me wrong, a lot of people come into this season would have taken 1-1 versus those, but everybody adjusted expectations a little bit, and that's what happens in week one sometimes. You overreact, and probably expectations come into it a bit too. I before the season started, had pegged Florida second in the East, 9-3, but said if it went one way or the other, I was thinking 8-4 instead of 10-2. So okay, I wasn't expecting this big great season. Ended up 6-6, but Florida beats Utah. Maybe reset expectations a bit, but then, like I said, it came crashing down the week after versus Kentucky. So you start the season 1-1, then the ugly performance versus South Florida. You hope you can rally and maybe do something against Tennessee. Not the case. It was a 5-point loss. Maybe not as close in some eyes, but you found a way to fight back, get back in that game late. Eastern Washington, Missouri, you back-to-back wins there. And then, of course, the LSU comes in and you kind of light the spark there in LSU. They were coming off that loss to Tennessee. Jaden Daniels kind of makes his statement of the season by coming into the swamp and putting up 45 on Florida when the LSU offense really wasn't all that great coming into the game either. Of course, bye week, and then Georgia, you're not really expected to do that. You make a close game in the third quarter. Georgia runs away with it anyway. Then, of course, what we've talked about the last month or so, you had a chance in November to really turn some things around. And it looked like Florida was on their way. You had some momentum. You had 6 quarters of great defensive football for the Gators. You beat Texas A&M. You beat South Carolina. You dominate South Carolina, only to turn around. Cannot ride that wave of momentum. No consistency from this team shown once again. Inexcusable loss to Vanderbilt. And then get beat by Florida State after beating them 3 times in a row. And they were the team in the state of Florida when everybody was picking Florida and everybody's picking Miami to do good things with first-year head coaches. Florida State was actually the team in the state of Florida, lo and behold, to be the best team in the state when it's all said and done. So, pretty basically, I put it, but everybody, no surprise, not really digging deep here, but on the surface, just a mark of inconsistency in Billy Napier's first season.
Yeah, you say inconsistency, but I actually think when you look a little bit closer, they were really consistent. And the problem is they were consistently bad on defense.
Yes.
So you look at the 4 rivals. You got
Or
Tennessee.
I can say the favorite saying, consistently inconsistent. There we go.
Yeah. So no, they were consistently bad. I mean,
on defense. Yes.
So you look at the 4 rivals: Tennessee, LSU, Georgia, and Florida State. They gave up 42.5 points per game in those 4 games. The lowest amount they gave up was 38 to Tennessee. And that was only because Tennessee turned the ball over a couple of times. And so those were like, if you told me before the season they were going to give up 42.5 points per game in those 4 games, I would have said, oh crap, we're 0-4. And that's exactly what happened. So to get to your 8-4 season that you're talking about meant you had to be perfect everywhere else. And obviously that didn't happen, right? But even then, I mean, the only other losses you have in addition to that are the loss to Kentucky, who was a pretty decent team, and then a loss to Vanderbilt, who wasn't, but obviously was much improved. Now, Kentucky and Vanderbilt are the things that you maybe blame Napier for, or say you need to get up for teams and those sorts of things. But the win over Utah is somewhat impressive, especially when you factor in that they're in the Pac-12 title game. So really, I think they were consistently bad on defense. The offense had to make up for it from time to time. I think they got a little bit lucky to get Utah early in the year before Utah knew how bad they were on defense and exactly how to exploit them. And by the second half, they'd kind of figured it out. And they got fortunate that Bernie was able to get that interception so that they could secure that win. But again, if you'd have told me that they were going to get up 42 points per game against those four, Tennessee, LSU, Georgia, and Florida State, I would have said we're already 0-4. And so that, to me, is the thing. Is I don't know that they were all that inconsistent. I think they had such a liability on one side of the field that it meant that the other side had to be perfect, and it just wasn't. And so you come out against Kentucky and you're bad offensively. We got no shot at winning that game. You come out against Vanderbilt and the offense just isn't clicking. And even against Vanderbilt, you don't have a shot to win that game because the defense gives up 31 points to Vanderbilt. Now, obviously, you got the special teams blunders, and there was a comedy of errors in that one that wound up giving Vanderbilt points. But still, 31 points to Vanderbilt. You're putting a ton of pressure on a unit that just was not perfect. And we knew the offense wasn't going to be perfect. The question was, how good could it be? And it was good, but not great. And it couldn't overcome that. So I really do look at it as you had this consistent motif of the defense just being bad throughout. And every once in a while, the offense was good enough to poke its head out and get a win. Sometimes the opponent was bad enough to allow the defense to stop them a little bit, like South Carolina. And sometimes the program they were playing was dysfunctional enough that it didn't matter, like Texas A&M. But when they played a team that was functional, when they played a team that had the ability to exploit the weaknesses that they had on defense, those teams were all able to take advantage of it. Even a South Florida team that was just awful this year was able to take advantage of the fact that Florida's defense could not get off the field. And that out of anything, I mean, we can talk about Napier and play calling and Richardson and giving the ball to running backs more and all those different kinds of things. But the reality is that if this defense doesn't get fixed, this program isn't getting fixed. And so that's really, I think, where the emphasis needs to be and the analysis needs to be going into the offseason for Napier and his staff.
Yeah, I'm not saying by any means the offense was perfect. I know there's a whole lot of offensive coordinator talk out there, and does Billy Napier need that? And, I put a tweet out there earlier this week. I'm not so sure OC as in play caller, but if it lightens up some other responsibilities that can make his job a bit easier, then okay, I'm all for it. I thought there was enough plays there to be made this year. I'm not so sure consistent enough at quarterback to get those. I think that, and we got plenty of time to get into that. Probably next week I think we'll go through the roster a bit and look back at I'm pretty sure, terrible over-unders. I know mine are. When we get to our preseason picks, and we'll go back and review those. We'll get more into player-specific thoughts here there. But, I think looking at of course, the results were inconsistent, but probably to Will's point, inconsistent results because of consistently bad defense. And as you said, Will, I like the way you said that the offense would poke its head out every now and then to change some of the fortunes there. For the results of the Gators. But yeah, it was just, I think, Will, the most frustrating part is not being able to build momentum when there seemed to be some. Like, there should have been some momentum after beating Utah. There should have been some momentum after beating Texas A&M and South Carolina. And maybe that's the mark of a first-year head coach. I know there's a lot of other first-year head coaches out there that had some success. And there's some reasons for some of those. And Lincoln Riley and USC and his Oklahoma transfers, of course, that would make sense for first year. Brian Kelly probably overshot some expectations first year at LSU, but more than likely was always going to be more instant success than Billy Napier anyway, given high program stature at Notre Dame, knowing a lot of the expectations. Okay, you can kind of explain that one there too. Not to excuse what Napier has done at Florida and what Brian Kelly's done at LSU, but I think you can pinpoint maybe something why he's having some more success. But maybe the momentum for Billy Napier and his team not being able to ride it, not being able to continue to build some, maybe that is the mark of a first-year head coach at a big-time program and the adjustment there.
Well, now you're getting me mad from the analytics side because we don't believe there is any such thing as momentum. Look, I'm saying that in jest, but I think that is true from game to game. The reality of college football or any sort of football really is that each game, you look at the result and that's all great. But, one of the reasons we look at like post-game win percentage and those sorts of things is that the score doesn't always tell you what's going on. And from the standpoint of like this team not being able to not being able to generate momentum. Well, part of that, it feels that way because you could never get a stop. And if you can't get a stop, then the only way you win a game is by outscoring your opponent or by keeping them off the field. So how many times did it feel like we went through a half and Florida had the ball twice?
Oh, yeah.
Because the offense for the other team came down the field, scored 3 touchdowns. Florida's offense scored 2, and you got 5 possessions, and it's 21-14, but it doesn't matter because the offense barely got to touch the ball.
It really felt like that in the first half of the season, and not really again until Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe that's because we were actually winning. But
right, yeah, right. I mean, as I said, there were 2 wins in there with A&M and South Carolina. Yeah.
Well, but and it's funny because, you look back at those and we got excited and we got those wins, and I'm not sure we expected to get both of those wins, but A&M won the first half against Florida, right? Mm-hmm. And South Carolina, as weird as this sounds, almost won the second half against Florida too, except for the fumbles and the 3 fumbles that Florida was able to convert into 7 points, but that was really it.
Hey, that second half of Florida's offense turned out to be kind of an indicator of what they would do against Vanderbilt and Florida State with not capitalizing on turnovers and red zone issues.
Yeah, but again, it's the inconsistency, I think, was on the offensive side of the ball, not the defense. Mm-hmm. The defense was consistently bad, which meant you couldn't gain any momentum. It meant that Anthony Richardson had to feel like he was perfect. It meant that if you have 3-3 announced against Florida State in a row, you're doomed. Right. And there are other programs where you get 3-3 announced and you go, hey, we're in a rock fight. Let's go win it. And they don't have the horses on that side of the ball. And they don't have certainly the experience. And perhaps they don't have the scheme. Now, I don't know. We're going to find out. Like I said, they stuck to their scheme in the Florida State game. And I think that's something we're going to learn is, what is the scheme with the right players going to turn things around quickly? Or are they going to continue to struggle because you have to have your perfect player, or in many cases have to have a more talented squad? Because look, one of the things at Louisiana that Napier was able to do was able to put together a team that was more talented than any of the other teams in the Sun Belt. And while he's bringing in more talent to Gainesville than either Jim McElwain or Dan Mullen did, he is not going to have a more talented team than Kirby Smart or Nick Saban anytime soon. And so, look, the jury is still out on whether the scheme is going to be able to stop offenses in the way that they want it to. And I am a little bit concerned that there weren't any adjustments, especially coming out of the second half, because in the second half, Florida State made some adjustments. They came after Richardson in that second half, and they made him really uncomfortable, and they blitzed him. And the minute he saw a guy blitzing, he became inaccurate. And, they sort of let him sit back there, and they were like, well, we're going to let you throw against the zone in the first half. And there were a few man-to-man opportunities where he was able to take advantage of it. But essentially they were only bringing 4. They were not blitzing, and he lit them up. And then the minute they made an adjustment, okay, now all of a sudden things fall apart. They never made that adjustment against Florida State. They never made that adjustment against Vanderbilt, to be honest. And so some of the losses are absolutely on the coaching and the scheme. The question is, were they making a point? And that may be the broader aspect of the inconsistency, Dave, is that there is value sometimes to just making a point and putting those guys out there and showing them that when it's done correctly, it works. And when it's done incorrectly, it doesn't. And we need you to consistently do this stuff correctly, because we're not going to switch. This is our identity. This is who we are. You're either going to buy in or you're not going to be here anymore. And, I think you and I both expect there's going to be a significant number of players who leave over the next week or two. I think December 5th is the day that guys have to get into the transfer portal by.
Yep.
So we should expect in the next week or two to see a significant portion of players who are going to be out the door. And I think that's going to be a big part of this, right? Is that the inconsistency and the inability to execute the schemes that are being asked are then going to be reflected in the players that decide to go elsewhere.
There was one more place I wanted to go with this. Man, it escapes me here. It may be something I'll bring back up later in the episode. Oh man, you brought up a good point. I think I was trying to come back with something else. Will, I'll have to see if it comes back to me. So much going on this episode. So, you brought up a good point on something. I didn't want to interrupt you again. Okay, if I come back to it, I'll come back to it.
Somebody help him in the chat.
Yeah, we got plenty to get into here for this episode of Gators Breakdown. But before we do, holiday season coming up. Hey, you need that garage door garage floor, need it with a new look. What about that patio out there? Well, how about give our friends at Shark Coatings a call?
You know the goosebumps you get when Florida takes the field? Or when that 63-yard Hail Mary actually works? Or the thrill of a game-winning interception in the end zone? What a rush! You can experience that same rush every day at your home with Shark Coatings. We'll cover your old, ugly concrete with a beautiful industrial concrete coating and a warranty that lasts longer than most careers in professional football. So whether your garage floor is for parking, partying, or working out, Shark Coatings can transform it. And if your pool deck is starting to look like a bulldog, old, cracked, and smells like pee, Shark Coatings can transform that too. Shark Coatings is easy to clean, stain resistant, and is 100% antibacterial and antimicrobial. We're easy on the eyes and on the maintenance. Gator Nation is worldwide, and Shark Coatings is based right in the heart of it. So whether you live in Brunswick, Georgia, or Live Oak, Florida, down to Ocala, over to New Smyrna Beach, or anywhere in between, contact us for a free estimate today. Learn more at sharkfloorcoatings.com. That's sharkfloorcoatings.com.
All right, Will. So with all that, we just took a look at the Gators schedule, and here's what it meant for the final 2022 SEC standings. Of course, this weekend took a little bit of a hit with LSU losing to Texas A&M, but in Atlanta in the SEC championship game is Georgia and LSU. Georgia still undefeated, 8-0, 12-0 overall. LSU 6-2 in the conference, 9-3. Not many people saw that one coming, but it is Georgia, LSU representing the SEC instead of, like most people pick, Georgia, Alabama. But Tennessee also kind of unexpected. They finished second in the East. South Carolina third, of course, their late season push with the big win over Tennessee, or they would have been in that 3-5 range along with Kentucky and Florida and Missouri. But you got South Carolina 4-4 in the conference, finishing third. Their big finish to the season, of course, 8-4 overall. I mean, Will, that was the weirdest thing. Of course, I put it out. My thought, you had Florida beating South Carolina. Both teams were sitting at 6-4 at the time. We thought Florida had the momentum. Little did we know South Carolina was going to go on the late season run, beat Tennessee and beat Clemson to end their season. But they did end the conference season 4-4. Then behind South Carolina, Kentucky, Florida, Missouri, all 3-5. Of course, Kentucky did beat Florida. But they were 7-5 overall as well. They got the win over Louisville to end the season. Florida 3-5, Missouri 3-5, both teams 6-6 overall. Vanderbilt with 2 conference wins, of course, over Kentucky and Florida. So that changed their fortune from years past. Alabama second in the West, 10-2 overall, 6-2 in the conference. Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Egg Bowl last week. Mississippi State comes out on top there, 4-4, both teams, 8-4, both teams as well overall. Arkansas probably a little disappointing overall to some. Finishing the season 6-6, 3-5 overall, much like Florida. Well, there you go. I mean, if you want some silver lining, a lot of people were high on Arkansas, and they finished 6-6 and 3-5, just like Florida does. This season, Auburn does not finish. Well, I mean, they're tied, Auburn and Texas A&M, I guess. But most people had Auburn in the cellar by themselves in the West, and of course, not Texas A&M, who finishes the season 2-6 by getting that big win over LSU to end the season. I had a weird feeling about that game anyway. I wasn't sure A&M was going to beat LSU, but for whatever reason, I thought they would give them a game, and they did. But 5-7 overall for Texas A&M. Of course, I think the biggest disappointment in the country. Will, so going back, I'm not sure you put your predictions out as far as where Florida would finish in the East. Of course, I put it out there before the season, so can't even erase it. Can't even lie about it if I wanted to. But I did have Florida second in the East behind Georgia, and then I think I had Tennessee third, Kentucky fourth. Wasn't too far on Kentucky there, but of course Florida not living up to the expectation I had for them this season. And then I had Alabama in the West. Of course, I'm not sure many people, unless they wear purple and gold behind the scenes, had LSU winning the West this year. But Georgia, the overwhelming favorite in the SEC this year. Well, 8-0, 12-0 heading into the SEC championship.
Yeah, so my stuff's out there because I sold a preseason magazine.
That's right. There you go. That's right.
So all you got to do to look at my predictions is slide Florida up there to second in the SEC East, and then everything is right other than Florida because I had.
You were pretty high on South Carolina.
I was high on South Carolina.
Yeah.
I was low on Kentucky, I think, more than I was high on South Carolina. And then on the West, I came pretty close. I had Alabama first, obviously. I think, if I recall correctly, I had LSU second and then Auburn third. I thought Auburn was going to be better. I thought Ole Miss and Mississippi State were going to take a step back. No. I had A&M second because I thought A&M was going to be pretty good. It is interesting, though, when you look at this, that there really are tiers, right? You've got Georgia, LSU, Tennessee, and Alabama in what I would call tier 1. Then you've got South Carolina, Kentucky, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss in tier 2. And then you got Florida, Arkansas, Missouri, Vanderbilt, Auburn, and Texas A&M in tier 3. And I think, if nothing else, there are a couple things.
Wait, I will get you there. Regrettably, I'll say tier 1 Georgia, tier 2 LSU, Tennessee, Alabama, and then a tier 3 after that.
So you're dead to me. I can't accept that. They are in the same class as LSU, Tennessee, and Alabama, and will always be. And as much as I was rooting for Texas A&M against LSU, now I'm rooting for LSU because nothing will please me more than being able to call Georgia the SEC runner-ups for the second year in a row. But my point in naming off those tiers is that there's two things. One is Arkansas, Auburn, Texas A&M, Vanderbilt, Missouri all have coaches who are not in their first year. So Florida is in that tier, but probably has more hope than any of those other 5 teams to get out of that tier. The other thing is, if you look at recruiting for the 2023 class, Florida is better than every team in the East except for Georgia. So in terms of being able to vault up to that number 2 spot, Florida should be able to get into that top tier in relatively quick time. However, you also have to look at this and be realistic and say, we're in the bottom tier of the SEC. Yep. And that's an unacceptable result. And so what are we going to change in order to get out of there? Because you're not just going to solve that problem by bringing in brand new true freshmen, no matter how highly ranked they are. There's going to have to be buy-in. There's going to have to be discipline. There's going to have to be improvement and development for the guys who are already in the program. And quite likely, there's going to be people that you bring in from the transfer portal to replace some of the people who leave in order to aid in that development as well. But so I look at it and I go, Florida's not in a bad spot from the standpoint of they can get out of this tier pretty quickly, but they need to be honest with themselves and understand they are in this tier, and that if you don't make changes, you're going to stay in this tier, and that will not be acceptable long-term for Florida fans. And so it's time to get to work.
Absolutely, Will. We will get to that transfer portal talk in just a second, but let's take an overall look. As I said, we'll get more detailed into players next week. But let's head over to some overall stats for the Gators this season via team rankings. And reminder, if you use team rankings, and Will and I like them a whole lot because they throw away the cupcakes. Stats only from games involving the FBS schools. So Florida's, Utah game, SEC games, Florida State game, all that stuff there. So points per game for the Gators, 48th in the country, 29.9. Okay, modest there overall, but points per game for the defense, 29.8. I mean, pretty much even, and that is good for 89th in the country there. Yards per game, 36th in the country at 420. Defense gave up about the same at 421 yards a game. That was good for 97th in the country. Yards per play on offense, 24th. Big there for the Gators, of course. Carried by that rushing attack for defense, giving up 6 yards of play. That was good for 110th in the country. Third down conversion percentage for the offense, not terrible, but kind of untimely this year. You'd love to see it a little bit higher there for the Gators. 40.5% there. Good for 44th in the country. Oof. There's my other oof for this episode. Opponent third down conversion for the defense, 127th in the country. We saw it on full display versus Florida State last Friday night, like we saw all season long. Gators giving up 49.66% of opponents' third down conversion. Not pretty. And then red zone scoring. Well, I didn't realize it was this bad for the Gators. 116th in the country on offense. 75% red zone scoring for the Gators. It was pretty bad on defense as well, giving up 85.4% there. Opponent red zone scoring percentage. That was good for 81st in the country. Will, what stands out to you there?
What stands out to me in all of this is that this is the profile of a 500 team. And
Hey, good point.
is that it turns out that every value on the left-hand side is really close to the values on the right-hand side, which usually mean you're going to go 500. And that's exactly what happened. Florida was 3-3 in one-score games. They happened to lose the last two of the year. They were 3-1. And so we're sitting there at 6-4, feeling all good about ourselves. And then they have a couple more one-score games. And granted, they felt different, but they were both 7-point games. And they end up 3-3. And so Napier's not some dynamic. And honestly, that's kind of the difference between him and Mullen and him and McElwain is those guys were unbelievable in one-score games the first 2 years they were there. And I think in many ways masked some of the holes that were there that then started showing up in year 3 and year 4 for those guys if they were able to make it to year 4.
Could the difference be a much better defense?
Well, I think that's some of it. I think the other, but I mean, I think you can also say that Napier had a more dynamic quarterback. So. Yeah. I think that in many ways the game management that Napier has shown, or the lack of game management that Napier has shown, is real. And there's no sense in trying to sugarcoat that. There are things that need to improve, especially the last 4 minutes of the first half and the first 4 minutes of the second half, where Florida just got mauled in just about every game that they played. And so he needs to improve as well. And I know people look at Louisiana and say, well, that's a different league and those sorts of things. And that's all true, but he was really good in one-score games there. I think, if anything, Napier has proven thus far that he's willing to be introspective and change things that aren't working in a way that we never got that sense from Dan Mullen. Now, we'll see whether
I got my point in, and I got my point again, kind of going along with this. He's done it before.
Sure. And that's great.
He's had a struggle at one season. I know it's a different level, but you got to think he learned something there. And we'll find out if he did or not. It may not mean anything, but if you are looking for some hope, it was a struggle with year 1. Now, it was his first overall year head coaching, so he had to learn a whole lot at Louisiana, more so than he did at Florida. It's just his first year at Florida, not his first year overall. But it was a struggle year 1. There was a bounce back.
So look, the teams that recruit in Florida's general area, and I'm going to have an article coming out later this week that details this in much, much more detail. But basically, they win about
a preview for that too. Will, that's one reason Will and I was late getting started on this. There's some really good stuff coming up there from Will. We were talking about it before the episode. So shout out to Will and a really good preview coming up this week.
Yeah, well, thanks. We lost track of time as I was going over the stuff. But basically, teams in Florida's range for recruiting over the past decade end up winning about 60% of their games. So Napier wound up 1 win less than what you would expect based on the talent on the team. So everybody sits here and goes, well, we're more talented than Kentucky. Well, we're more talented than Vanderbilt. You're absolutely true. It's absolutely true that Florida's more talented than those teams, but the talent only takes you so far. Just because you're more talented doesn't mean you win 100% of the time. It means it gives you a 70-30 advantage. It means it gives you a 60-40 advantage against some of those teams. And so sometimes you're going to come up snake eyes and hit those 40%. So I'm not all that discouraged at the 6-6. Like that doesn't kill me. What kills me is the lack of any sort of improvement on the defensive side of the ball, and that things, like you said, regressed as we got towards the end of the year. And those are the things that I think in order to sort of restore hope in that bowl game, I really want to see the defense come out and play well, right? And whether or not they're perfect, I don't think they will be, but you've now got a couple of weeks of practice where you can work on this stuff and start to instill it. Let's improve. And you don't have to improve everywhere. Let's improve in a couple of places. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. But I also think that, to your point, it's unfair to judge Napier in terms of whether he can or can't turn this program around year 1, because there's a bunch of different reasons. But one of them is these aren't his players. 2 is that they had a very difficult schedule to start with. 3 is that he had inconsistency on both sides of the ball. But I think it's fair to say, look, the defense was a lot worse this year than it was last year with approximately the same players. And so that needs to improve and improve quickly. So it's sort of that double-edged sword, right? Where you look at, like, I'm not disappointed at 6-6. I'm disappointed at the Vanderbilt loss making us 6-6. And if they were 7-5 and had just won that Vanderbilt game by 15, we'd be sitting here going, okay, yeah, like everything feels great. It's that loss that weighs on you, because There were coaching issues there. There were discipline issues there. There were all the things that we were sort of promised that we thought were issues under Dan Mullen that were going to be taken care of under Billy Napier, and they're still popping up. Now, again, he needs to have some time to be able to fix those things. It's not, it's one of those things where if there's 47 problems to be dealt with and he got to the first 20, well, hey, we're 20 problems. We've solved the first 20. The problem is there's still 25 problems that he's got to deal with. And the question will be, what does that look like? And again, like I said earlier, I think we are expecting there to be a pretty significant departure rate of players who are on this team. And so this team's going to look a lot different next year than it does right now.
All right, so now let's go a little more detail here. Rush, pass, both sides of the ball as well. Florida's offense, yards per rush, 5.6. That was good for 5th in the country. And that's, like I said, just involving the games versus 2 FBS schools. Rushes per game, 37. Will, I would argue that could have been even higher. when you go back and look at it, sometimes I thought they either made or let Anthony Richardson pass too much. Rushing yards per game, Gators 207 and a half yards. That's good for 16th in the country. Go to the other side, not so good for the defense. Opponent's yards per rush, 4.8. That was good for 106th in the country. Opponent rush yards per game, 183. That was good for 104. I mean, a lot of over 100 ranks for this defense there for the Gators. Let's go to the passing statistics now. Yards per pass, 7.3. Not a whole lot. Of course, there were some big plays there by Anthony Richardson in this receiver core, but all in all, not too much. Passes per game, about 29. Like I said, in the games Florida won, it wasn't that high for the most part. Passing yards per game, of course, 212. I wouldn't have minded that if there was more rushing yards to go along with it. Interceptions, percentage thrown, 2.48, about 2.5. That was good for 67 in the country. Quarterback sacked, good there. Good job by the offensive line and Anthony Richardson avoiding sacks a whole lot. The stat that came out today, of course, Osiris Torrance will not giving up a sack in his whole career, which is unbelievable. But it translated from Louisiana to SEC play at Florida. Going to the defense, of course, opponent yard per pass, pretty much 8. It was at 7.9. That was good for 105th in the country. Opponent pass yards per game, 238. That was good for 81st in the country there. Sack percentage, 5.4. That was good for 88. So we'll get into it next week when we do our over-unders, but Florida didn't get anywhere near the sacks this year that they were getting under Todd Grantham's defense. Well, of course, we knew he was known for that. Didn't really help in the end, of course, making the defense better there for the Gators. But breaking it down, Will, rushing, passing in more detail here quickly, any of that stand out for you?
I mean, I think there are two things. One is that the offense overall was pretty successful, but that it was dependent on the rush game. And when the rush game was stopped, then the offense was completely stagnant. And in college football today, you can't have that. You got to be able to throw the ball in college football. And, you'll hear the coaches talk about, you got to run the ball to win. That's garbage. Throw for 10 yards an attempt, and it doesn't matter whether you can run the ball. And that's the way college football is. And so finding the guy who's going to be the quarterback, whether that's Richardson or whether that's somebody else who can get them into the 8, 9, 10 yards per attempt stratosphere is where they're going to have to be to really make this offense feel dynamic. And if you go and look at the time that Florida's offense under Mullen actually felt dynamic, turns out it was with Kyle Trask, who was right in that area, right? Averaging 8, 9, 10 yards a throw. And that's when the offense felt dynamic. And so if you feel like Napier's offensive scheme is vanilla, if you feel like it's unreliable, if you feel like it's very start and stop, one of the reasons you feel that way is the guy pulling the trigger this year was not able to allow it to be consistent. And we saw that sort of at its extremes in the Florida State game. The other thing is that Florida did not help itself when you look at just overall special teams. I don't know. Do you have a thing on special teams here?
I do, yes. It should be here. I think some special team stats, I believe.
All right, because where I was going was their actual.
That's just kicking. My bad, sir. Not
Okay.
Yeah.
So where I was going was actually their field position. Their average start on defense was 67.5 yards from scoring. So versus their offense that was 72 yards from scoring. So there was about a 5-yard difference between where their defense had to defend and where their offense had to start from. And that essentially put them behind the 8 ball in every single game that they played. Now, some of that is because they stubbornly refused to stop bringing the ball out on kickoffs, or at least early in the year. Some of that is penalties that occurred on those sorts of things.
And before they put ETN back there.
Yep. Some of that is having the wrong personnel back there, and some of that is the turnovers. You end up with 0 defensive yards to go when you turn over a punt that gets muffed into the end zone. So there's a bunch of things that factor into there, but I think from the standpoint of they didn't win the little things, the edge things that could make a difference, that they were actually giving the opponent points just in terms of starting field position, as opposed to gaining them. And then on defense, particularly on passing downs, so the success rate on defense was really, really bad. It was 44% overall, and then 38% on passing downs, which is just really bad. And then they gave up really, really a ton of explosive plays, particularly in the passing game. When you look at the advanced stats overall, their explosiveness metrics and success rate metrics and things like that. They didn't create a whole bunch of havoc on the defense. The offense was really good at protecting Anthony Richardson, but the defense wasn't very good at creating any havoc. So what you had was a team that was relying on turnovers, gave up a bunch of explosive plays, didn't have a whole lot of success when they couldn't get any sort of havoc on the offense, and didn't have good starting field position. And if it feels like Florida always gave up touchdowns when there was a turnover or something like that, the reality is that they did. They gave up 4.3 points per opportunity. So anytime the opponent had the ball inside the 40-yard line, they had 4.3. They gave up 4.3 points on those opportunities, and that's bad. Yeah. So the offense was scoring 3.8. That's actually pretty good. But 4.3 would be like elite on the offensive side of the ball if you scored that many times every time you got inside the opponent 40. Right, because sometimes you're gonna have a turnover, sometimes you're gonna turn it over on downs, sometimes you're gonna settle for a field goal. So the fact they're giving up more than a field goal on 71 opportunities, to me, suggests exactly where the problem lies. And again, I get why people are asking for an offensive coordinator, but I think with more consistent quarterback play, the offense is gonna feel much, much different. And then with a defense that can actually stop somebody, you won't need the quarterback to be quite as efficient either. And so I think we sort of hit an amalgam of circumstances here where Richardson was probably the wrong quarterback for as bad as this defense was. And the team would have felt a lot different if Richardson had been at the helm with a defense that could get stops, or if you had maybe somebody like Jack Miller or Jalen Kitten in there who could be more consistent because the defense was struggling so much. But obviously, because of the explosiveness of Richardson and because of sort of the ability to overcome some of his deficiencies, that really opened things up, I think, in the running game, and then also allowed Florida to at least have a dynamic offense, if not a consistent one.
Yeah, I do wonder if some of those late game situations were more AR limitations, more so than Napier limitations. That's something we'll have to kind of let time go and see as well. I know there's the part of adapting to your personnel, and hey, look, that's valid. That's valid, but hey, look, all water under the bridge now. We'll kind of just have to see if more of Billy Napier's talent that he acquires changes some of those things. All right, some miscellaneous stats here before we move on to some roster management notes before we sign off here on this episode. Kicking statistics here, Gators field goal conversion percentage, not great. Special teams were, of course, Will mentioned it too, but kickoff punt returns, of course, you see. I know Henderson was back there most of the year. We weren't really excited to see that after him being there previous years as well. Not much going on. You see Ricky Pearsall gets some opportunity back there, and there did seem to be a little more electricity back there in the punt return. Same with ETN in the kickoff return. So I think we may see some preview of next year, what we can expect in those two spots, of course. Now, turnover statistics, of course, as well. Got better for the offense as the year went on. We know the turnover machine Anthony Richardson was. in the first at least quarter of the season, almost to the first half of the season. But those first few games really, really bad for Anthony Richardson when he was tossing interceptions before he was tossing touchdown passes. Giveaways a game, they were 44th in the country with 1.3 there for the Florida offense. Interception percentage tied for 67th in the country. But the Gator defense, of course, if there was one thing you could kind of put a feather in the cap on, is they were able to create some turnovers this season. 12th in the country, 1.9 takeaways a game there for the Gators defense. So, at least they were able to get the offense the ball even more. But we'll talk about this before the episode. Penalty statistics, and it was a little surprising to see Florida so high in some of these rankings and penalties. I know the last couple of games, as we pointed out earlier, were pretty detrimental for the Gator squad, but penalties per play for the Gator offense, it was 0.05. That was 96 in the country. Penalties per game, 6.6. That was 87th in the country, but penalty yards per game, 44th. So kind of modest there. When you get that many penalties where you're 87th in the country, the yards are only equal to 44th in the country. Their penalty yards per penalty was only 7.2. That was third in the country there for the Gators. So, as I said, it really got bad those last couple games of the season, but as a season as a whole, not too many yards hurting the Gators. The defense, though, yeah, it was. That's where it really cost the Gators. They were opponent penalty yards per game for 43.8. That was good for 107th in the country. Yards per penalty, 7.9. That was 115th in the country. I didn't realize it was that bad, Will.
I mean, again, I go back to what I said earlier, which is I'm not sure that you measure discipline by penalties. And I think you measure discipline. Honestly, this is one where I think you measure it via eye test, or you measure it by like number of unsportsmanlike penalties on third down per game or something like that. I don't know how you measure those discipline penalties other than maybe going and actually starting to count them up. And the thing is like you go back to the Vanderbilt game and there was just a litany of errors, but the errors were in different areas the whole time down. I think that's maybe the thing, that if there was a stat that just was like potential points given away or gained, that Florida definitely gave away more points than they gained this year in terms of their overall discipline. And I think you see that in the field position stats. I think you see that a little bit here in the penalty stats. I think you certainly see it in the turnover stats, though the turnovers I think are a little bit misleading just because I think they had so many shots and so many plays that eventually they were able to get some turnovers. I think there's some stats out there. I know Nick Knudsen looked earlier this year at like the theoretical yards that could have been gained versus the actual yards that were gained. And after the LSU game, it was something really ugly. And I suspect that it didn't get a whole lot prettier as the season went along. So there are a lot of different ways to measure discipline. I think we can beat the dead horse all we want, but this was not a very disciplined team, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And that's going to have to improve. I'm just not sure that you measure it with penalties. It's like when and we were talking before we came on that when Brandon Spikes hit Noshawn Marino in the Florida Georgia game and just laid him out, it was sort of jawing at him while he's on the ground. Like these days, that's a penalty. But I'd be happy to see that sort of play, in the Florida Georgia game next year. If Florida's middle linebacker comes up and just absolutely obliterates the running back for Georgia and he gets a 15-yard penalty, I'll say that's a dumb penalty. But in some ways, that's sort of the attitude and the swagger and all those things that's associated with that.
Two more.
Necessary.
Brandon Spikes punting the ball in the end zone versus LSU. Andre Caldwell scoring and throwing the ball into the crowd like a court. I mean, like you said, it's not the ultimate. And I'm sure a coach on the sideline doesn't really, care to see it either. But probably in the locker room, it's just like hey, all shucks, you did that. Oh, come on.
Well, and it comes back to when you don't have elite talent, you have to squeeze everything out of the guys that you do have. Yeah. And so those sorts of things really start to make a difference when you're Wisconsin or when you're Iowa, or quite honestly, right now, when you're Florida. And that doesn't mean that Florida has no talent, but it does mean that their talent is not at a point. Like there is no Brandon Spikes on the roster right now. There is no Percy Harvin on the roster right now. And Percy Harvin could do something like that and cost him a 15-yard penalty because guess what? He's going to get 35 yards on the next play. And there are very few players on this roster who have shown that. And one of the things I was actually thinking during the Florida State game, as Jordan Travis was running around, is how many times have we had a game where someone was chasing Anthony Richardson around and was just like frustrated at the inability to actually get him to the ground? Where
the Utah game, maybe,
but even that one, I wouldn't say that Utah walked out of that game going, we just couldn't stop him. Now, they couldn't stop him right at the end, but I don't think they walked out of that one going, that guy single-handedly beat us. And I think that's what Florida fans walked out of Doak Campbell saying, is that Jordan Travis single-handedly beat Florida. That if they'd had Thad Busby back there, some guy with zero mobility, then Florida wins that game. And the fact
if they had Jordan Travis last year, Jordan Travis.
Well, so it turns out you can develop a quarterback apparently, and hey, good for him, right? I think that's great for him. But what I was trying to say is that when you're on the margins, you need to get every single edge you can. And Florida did not get those edges this year. And is Napier going to be a guy who consistently gets those edges? I don't know. But I think if you ask about Urban Meyer and did he always consistently get those edges, you were just talking about multiple circumstances where his team made stupid 15-yard penalties, but we didn't care because Florida won the game by 20 points at the end of the day anyway. And you're like, okay, they were that much better than the opponent that it didn't matter. And there was no game this year where I felt like Florida was so much better than the opponent, maybe South Carolina. But there, what game, and Eastern Washington, definitely. But those were the only two games I look at and I go, okay, we're so much better than the opponent that we can screw around and we can do extra stuff. Whereas I feel like there are games where Georgia right now could just walk in, roll out the ball, commit penalty after penalty after penalty, and probably still walk out with a win. And there's a difference between those two. And, I think if you look back, and in fact, I know that if you look back at Kirby Smart's season, his first season in 2016, just the game against Tennessee was a comedy of errors between him and Butch Jones. Now, Butch obviously no longer there at Tennessee for various reasons, some of which have to do with his ability to coach in game. But a bigger reason is that he was down in the Florida area of recruiting and needed all those edges. So he needed to execute on all those little things that gave him an edge, whereas Kirby Smart hasn't had to do that. And in fact, when he has, it's cost him a national championship, right? I mean, I think you can make some arguments that some of the decisions that he's made in some of the playoff games have cost his team championships. Now, last year they were able to get it done, but there were some questions about whether he was going to be able to get it done because of some of his in-game coaching. And it turns out that even with Stetson Bennett at quarterback, they had just an elite transcendent defense last year and were able to get it done. I'm actually curious to see whether they're going to be able to do it this year. I know you had them up in that tier 1, but I've watched Stetson Bennett play. And I know that their defense isn't as good as it was last year. It's still good, but it's not as good as it was last year. And I do wonder whether there's going to be a closing of the gap between some of the teams that's going to play in this playoff. And
well, I don't think overall college football is as good this year.
Well, I think that's true too. But again, this is sort of what I'm getting at is if Kirby came back to the pack a little bit in terms of if Bennett's struggling and if the defense is a little bit worse, well, now he's going to have to figure out how to get those little edges. Can he get those little edges, or is he going to do something that costs his team 3 points or 7 points or 14 points in an important game? And is Georgia going to go down? I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that until he got to Alabama last year, he couldn't screw that one up. Right? The way the defense was and as consistent as Bennett was playing for the most part, though he played badly in the Florida game, but as consistently as Bennett was playing and as good as that defense was, no one was beating them during the regular season. It took a team like Alabama getting hot to beat them in the SEC championship game, and then they couldn't sustain it in the rematch, and that's how you end up with Georgia as the national champion. So I think there's, again, I just go back to Florida right now needs Napier to get every edge. And if he's not going to do that, then there's another way to build, and he's going to have to build that way. Otherwise, he's going to have to keep seeking those edges, and that means he'll have to improve too.
Sounds good. Let's get to roster management right quick, Will. That would be something we kind of review and look ahead a little bit at the same time. Of course, transfer portal opening up, of course, for college football on December 5th. So, of course, instead of being able to leave a school at any time, players now have to enter the transfer portal within set dates. Of course, you hear announcements now, but nothing official until December 5th, and it closes 45 days later January 18th. So between now and December 5th, you're going to hear announcement galore of guys putting their name into the transfer portal. And look, it can say the window's 45 days. If you want to be in the class, you're probably going to have to be in before early signing day for the most part. I think a lot of this is going to take shape before early signing day on December 21st, I believe. So they can say December 5th to January 18th. There might be some that lag behind right before National Signing Day in February. I think that's why they put that January 18th as the end date there. But December 5th, right after the championship game weekend, being that day, I think decisions are going to be made pretty fast here in the next, or starting for the 45 days, starting December 5th. But for the Gators, some roster management has already happened. Of course, today we announced Florida. It was announced that Avery Helm, cornerback for the Gators, would transfer, and the number of cornerbacks Florida's bringing in this class, of course, what Florida already has as well. Once Jaden Hill returned, Avery Helm's playing time went down. No surprise, really, when you sit and think about it, with the numbers Florida has at the cornerback position. And then, of course, we've talked about some of these throughout the last few weeks, mostly kind of concentrated on the season. Not a lot of threat here for Florida as far as roster detriment that happened with a lot of these announcements. Tight end, defensive lineman, offensive lineman, Griffin McDowell, linebacker DeJuan Black, of course, one of the more popular names there. A lot of people want a success for DeJuan Black, but he was dismissed just a couple of weeks ago. Tight end Nick Elksness, didn't see a whole lot of playing time, was a lot injured a good bit, dating back to the spring. Good, at least in high school here in Jacksonville, a good run after the catch tight end. Just did not get to see enough of Nick Elksness in his time there. Trent Whittemore, probably the biggest one, Will. I know you and I spoke about that. That one was probably the more polarizing of the bunch there. I think a lot of people out there thought he should get more of an opportunity, but seeing he was behind Ricky Pearsall and more of that slot role, very easy to see why he wasn't getting the playing time, especially what we saw Pearsall do at the beginning of the Florida State game. Offensive lineman Josh Braun, of course, through two staffs, was not really able to – one of the higher offensive line recruits in Dan Mullins and John Hevesey's recruiting over the last few years, just not able to break through now on two staffs there along the offensive line. Then long snapper Marco Ortiz, defensive back Kamara Wilcoxon, an offensive line outside linebacker Brenton Cox, who was dismissed right after the Georgia game, of course, there. So there's kind of your roster catch-up. I would expect more names coming soon as far as an exodus goes from this Florida Gator roster heading into the transfer portal. And then we'll see who Florida – I expect Florida to be very active as well, bringing guys in from the transfer portal.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I suspect that at this point, everybody pretty much knows where the musical chairs are going to end up. That there have been discussions in back channels for all these guys. I don't know whether I think maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, the players were probably naive to the transfer portal process, and you wound up with guys who went into the portal and then had nowhere else to go. I think for the most part, if you're going into the portal at this point, you've probably had discussions with someone, whether that's a reputable someone or not, I guess is the question and what it's going to be. But so Florida generally probably has a pretty good take on, or a pretty good bead on who's going to be available and who they could potentially go after. And it's the same thing with these guys. These are guys who clearly, I mean, look, the only guy on this list, well, there's two guys on this list who were real contributors this year. Cox, one of them, and obviously he got dismissed from the team. And then Helm was a contributor at cornerback. Everybody else was at least on the second unit, if not a little bit deeper on the depth chart. And so these are the guys who are going to leave when Napier's bringing his guys in. I don't think that's a surprise. And I think it's a healthy thing. I think one of the things that if you look back at the Mullen era that was unhealthy is that 2020 team was just dominated by Jim McElwain recruits. And the minute those guys left, the whole bottom fell out. And we don't want to see that happen. We want to see healthy turnover. Now, that does mean you're going to have to hit on Napier's recruits, and he's going to have some guys who probably play early, maybe even a little bit out of their depth at the same time. Getting those guys in here, getting them situated within the program, and getting them to hopefully go into the NFL 3 years in is really the goal. And you're going to have an opportunity to do that rather than having guys stay for 4 and 5 years and sticking around for a COVID year and those sorts of things. I think at this point, roster management is going to be more about every 3 years turning things over, as opposed to trying to squeeze as much as you can out of guys who happen to hit.
Yeah, and now looking at it too, Will, of course, we look at who like Jordan Pouncey, Ventrell Miller, Amari Burney, Trey Dean, those guys gone, Lorenzo Lingard, Naquan Wright, Justin Shorter, won't be a part. Ricky Pearsall here, likely. Will probably stick around for another year at Florida, so he's got some eligibility left. Osiris Torrance, of course, expected to go to the draft. Richard Garage has a decision coming up if he'll return or not. So there's a couple names there to maybe look forward to as maybe declaring for the draft. Of course, Anthony Richardson will be waiting for his announcement as well. And the thought to whether he's ready or not is he will be going to the NFL draft, but we'll see when and where we hear about that. Of course, one big storyline we're waiting for here as part of Gator Nation to see what Anthony Richardson does in his future. And of course, he declares that probably opens the door up for a transfer quarterback to come in and battle it out with Jaden Rashada and guys already on the roster of Jack Miller and Jalen Kitna. We got plenty of time to get into that if and when it happens. But some interesting roster moves coming up, Will. And, hey, look, early signing day, not that far away as well. Visits will be starting to happen on campus coming up in the next few weeks as well. To recap their 2024 or 2023 24/7 sports recruiting rankings, Alabama 1, Georgia 2, Notre Dame 3, Texas 4, LSU 5, Ohio State 6, Oklahoma 7, Florida 8, Clemson at 9, Miami 10, Tennessee 11. Well, I still think we got plenty to talk about these next few weeks.
Yeah, I imagine so. It's funny, like everybody will start freaking out. I think it was Rick Wells put something on Twitter today about guys leaving the program, and it was right before Helm announced that he was leaving. And I'm sitting there going, it's a program that's gone 6-6 for the last 2 years. Like, change needs to occur, right? Yeah. Like, turnover is good. Like, that is a positive thing. Now, obviously, if you end up with no offensive lineman at the end of it, then that's a problem. But I don't think that Napier is naive to who's going to stay and who's going to leave. He hopefully has a pulse and a relationship with all the guys on the team, and hopefully has encouraged them. Like, I look at it, and I mean, I say this to people who work for me too, is my job is to make you more marketable to the world in general, and then pay you commensurate with what your value is to the company that I work for. And I feel like college football is sort of the same way, that if you're a coach, your job is to get guys to the NFL, but it's also to prepare them to be successful in that next phase. And sometimes preparing somebody to be successful is to go, look, we got a guy coming in next year who's going to start, and he's going to start for a lot of different reasons. And he may not even be better than you when he comes in here day one, but he's going to be better than you 6 games in, 8 games in, 12 games in. And so for you to improve and you to get the reps you need and get the attention you need to go someplace else. And that's an honorable thing to do if you're a coach, to go and say that and say, look, I know you committed here. You didn't commit to me. And so I didn't commit to you, right? I didn't actually give you any promises about your playing time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you that turnover is best for all of us. So I'm not going to freak out if people leave. I'm going to smile, and I'm going to wish them well. I hope they do well. I hope all the guys who transfer out of Florida and go someplace else play really, really well wherever they go. Right? I'm glad when Chester Kimbrough gets an interception. I'm glad when Chris Bogle gets a sack. I'm glad when Tyron Hopper plays well against Georgia, not so much when he plays well against Florida. But those are all guys I hope they do well, because they have an opportunity that not a lot of us do to get to the pros, and they got to do what's best for them in order to try to get that opportunity, whether it's through NIL money that they get now while they're in college, or whether it's getting those contracts in the NFL. You got to do what's best for you. And to be honest, there are guys who Napier's program and what Napier's trying to build are not going to be right for them. Like this year, you had to sort of patch things with 5th-year seniors and super seniors and things like that. If you're still patching things with 5th-year seniors next year, that's a problem, right? In fact, you'd rather be losing with like sophomores and juniors than you would have guys who are 5th year who you've got to replace. And that's not a knock at Ventrell Miller. It's that if Ventrell Miller had another year of eligibility, I'd be saying, he might be a really valuable piece at a school that's really close to getting over the hump. But in year 2 of Napier's rebuild, I'm not sure that that person has the same value to the Florida program as opposed to getting in a really skilled, 4 or 5 star linebacker, and you say you're starting day 1, so you better get the reps, and you're gonna be prepared to go day 1, and you need to be the quarterback of the defense. And same thing with the quarterback position, right? If Anthony Richardson decides to leave, okay, well now there's real value in getting a guy in there and getting him reps all off season, getting him ready to go, as opposed to competing with a guy like Richardson. And then if Richardson goes down with an injury or something like that, well now, who do you have behind him, which is kind of where we were this year. So I think building up that depth, but really building up the confidence in the guys who are coming into the program is a big part of this. And guys leaving is just the natural side effect of that.
All right. That'll do it for this episode of Gators Breakdown. Season's no more game to talk about, Will. We'll see what happens with the bowl game and the Gators. Birmingham Bowl, Las Vegas Bowl seems to kind of be the two that are thrown out there right now. Vegas Bowl versus UCLA, or the Birmingham Bowl versus, I think, Memphis is what I saw. So give me the Las Vegas Bowl any day. But look, I don't even know what Florida. I don't know who'd be on Florida's roster when the game is played. We're sitting here talking about transfers, and if guys are going to transfer out, they probably are not going to want to play for the Gators in the bowl game. So who knows what the team will look like when the bowl game is decided. We'll find that out Sunday night. I'll probably throw a quick episode together to kind of initial reaction of who Florida draws in a bowl game, but that's kind of seems the two likely ones right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you're a Gator fan who's going to go to the bowl game, Las Vegas or Birmingham, I think it's pretty clear where you'd probably want to go.
There's plenty of reasons to want the Las Vegas Bowl versus you if UCLA is the team too. But
and hey, you either go to a casino and celebrate after a Gator win, or you go to a casino and drown your sorrows, try to win some money after the Gators lose. So there's probably a betting strategy there where you can end up happy regardless of what happens in the game. But no, I mean, look, Vegas is a great town. I've enjoyed my time out there, and that is definitely. I'm pretty sure that based on schedules and things like that, I'm not going to be going to this one. But
that one's on a Saturday too, so that's another reason I hope it's the Vegas Bowl, because that one's a Saturday. So
maybe I will. No,
yeah.
I don't think I'm able to swing that one, man. I got too much stuff going on during the holidays. But from the standpoint of like for fans and enjoyment and the players and enjoyment, oh man, the Vegas Bowl is so much better. Give us that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Getting up for a bowl game's hard enough these days, but you go say you got to play in cold Birmingham with a roster that may be gutted with guys leaving the program. Guys will be Music City Bowl. I see some people throwing that in there too. I have heard that one. Gasparilla, I don't know if they can play in that one in back-to-back years. I know there's some bowl games you can't take the same team 2 years in a row. As far as record goes, I know that could, Florida's got the same record they had last year going into bowl season. That could be in the mix. I don't know if the Gasparilla has that contingency or not, if they can take the same team 2 years in a row. But I'm sure they'd like it if they could get the Gators again, because it being in Tampa. But
I'm just in favor of Las Vegas, because if we need to weed out discipline problems, nothing's going to do it like having a curfew in Las Vegas, buddy.
Good point. All right, well, we kind of teased it a little bit, but one more time, what you got coming up this week on Read and Reaction?
Yeah, so I'm going to be looking at Napier's recruiting class, and really I've taken a pretty in-depth look at recruiting classes all the way back to 2015 and what that means in terms of winning percentage and who's winning, who's not. I think there's some good news in there for Gator fans. I think there's also some concerning stuff, and so looking at where the class is now, what has to happen to finish off, and what we should expect in early signing day and that sort of stuff. So it's probably going to be a series of articles over the next few weeks, sort of breaking things down, but starting out with what's happened historically. And NIL obviously has changed the landscape, but I think it's instructive. I showed you some of the charts before we came on here, and you look at it and go, like at least I looked at it and went, I wouldn't have expected it to be quite like that. And so I think that's kind of cool, because there are times where you yell top 3 class, top 5 class, top 7 class. Was that really true? And so is it or is it not? That's sort of the question that I'm trying to answer.
Yeah, and you show it can go deeper then top 3, top 5, top 7, top 10. So Will's got some good stuff coming out, guys, this week at Read and Reaction. You check him out at Read and Reaction on YouTube as well, and make sure you follow him on Twitter. He shares the articles there at Will Miles SEC. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.